Hey friends, Andy Jenkins with the Warrior Hope Podcast. In the previous episode, here we are in episode number 4 already. In the previous, in 3, I talked about the idea that war changes people. Well, the fact is, non-war changes people as well. And I want to set this up with referring to what several warriors that we've interviewed at different times have actually said about their service. And these are incredible men. They happen to all be men that I'm referring to here in this episode. We've referred to and featured women veterans before, and we'll do that again in upcoming episodes. We've also featured men and women professionals. These just happen to all be men. I want you to notice something. These are incredible warriors, yet in the interview, they all reference the idea that they were not on the front lines. Now, here is Sergeant Major Bryant that has been featured on this podcast before and is in our upcoming film, Trauma Comes Home. Notice what he says.
Well, actually, I was never actually in combat. Of course, my jobs, I had various jobs within the Army. I started out in the infantry as a infantryman, 11 Charlie at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. And while I was there, I switched over involuntarily to become a 13 Foxtrot Forward Observer, which is field artillery. And that's where I spent the bulk of my time, even though when I was in Germany, my first tour, I switched over to become a 73 Charlie, which is a finance clerk. I was an auditor. I audit records and established pay accounts for soldiers coming on active duty. And from there, I went to become a drill sergeant for 3 years. Now, while I was on drill sergeant duty, I went back from finance to field artillery, specifically 13 Foxtrot. And that's where I stayed until I retired in 2001.
Now, at some point, I want you to notice this, he had a job in finance. So he's likely making sure that the bills get paid and probably that people get paid. It's very similar here to what Eric Fort. Eric this clip comes from it was really kind of a end of year highlight reel after we led a Centers of Hope group of what we did really as a promotional piece to get the next group going. Notice what Eric says. He was a Marine Corps Reserve that was deployed in the middle of college when he was here in town in Birmingham at Samford University and had to leave right there in the middle of it all and then come back. Notice what he says.
I was in the Marine Corps Reserves based out of Bessemer, Alabama in 1987 to 1993. I got out as a corporal and I was an 0131. That's right, guys. I was an admin, but I was the one to help get you paid.
Now, I find all this very interesting because we somehow relegate ourselves, and I certainly don't want to put sentiment or feeling into these men, as a second status of veteran. Like sometimes our veterans might tend to do that, even though in 1 Samuel 30, there's this story where King David and his mighty men, not as mighty men at the time, his kind of ragtag group, some of which became the mighty men later on, all of their stuff is stolen while they're off at war. And they come back, and so what they do is they decide that several of the men are going to stay and guard what's left, supplies. They're going to make the men who can go fight and pursue the people who robbed them, make them be very light. And so some stay, some go. The ones who go regain everything that was taken and stolen and more, and then bring it back. And this disagreement erupts as to who gets to share the bounty. And so David resolves it and says, hey, who went to fight and who stayed behind to support those who went to fight share alike, because they're all necessary. Now think about these 2 previous examples that I've shared with you. I've got one more, but think about those 2. If nobody is behind training people to go to the front lines, what are they going to be like when they get out there? That's what Sergeant Major Bryant was doing. In addition, if nobody, he did this as well, and Eric did this, if nobody's back sure making certain everyone gets paid, imagine what's going to happen to people's homes, to their families, while they're out fighting. Imagine the extra stress that's going to put to people who are out on the battlefield. Probably not going to go well. The third final guy I have here is Chris Turner. Now, he is a Marine. He is the artist that is featured on Crosswinds Freedom Tour, where we'll go to a VFW, Veterans of Foreign Wars outpost, or to other places, have a concert, start up a Center of Hope there in that area. He's also the artist that you see playing at the beginning and then throughout the Trauma Comes Home documentary, playing his original song. Right there, you hear part of his story at the beginning of that. He's also, I'm going to feature him later on in one of the podcast episodes in this season. Now, notice what Chris says just when he's talking, when he's sharing his story. Notice one of the first things that just kind of comes out of his mouth. This isn't a promotional piece that we put together. Notice this.
Fridge, my name is Chris Turner. I'm a United States Marine. I was a 2512 field wireman. I went to boot camp at Parris Island, and I'm not a combat Marine, and I'm not going to try to pretend that I am, but I did do field wire, and I was deployed to Okinawa, Japan, and I did some time in Korea.
And again, all of these men they're healthy men, and I don't just mean physically healthy. I mean they are emotionally healthy. They are incredible, secure in their identity, yet there is this idea that sometimes, might be carried that, hey, the ones that are on the front lines, again, not to diminish their status at all, but like somehow we take a secondary. The truth is this, and here's what I want to speak to today, particularly to non-combat veterans, is everyone was absolutely needed, and the reality is everyone also faced difficult things. Now, today I want to talk about the idea not just being away from family is being difficult, although that's certainly true, but notice, again, back to Sergeant Major Bryant, notice what he says here, and then we'll continue dialoguing.
That type of trauma does get overlooked because when you stop and think about it, the training that they're conducting is actual wartime training. Jump out of an airplane. When you practice that, you do it the way you would actually do it in combat. And yes, there are accidents that happen while you're training, whether it be a helicopter going down.
Now, on base, most training exercises are handled at combat speed because you're training for combat. So you can't train for that by just walking through things. And because of that, when you train, you're really jumping out of a plane. When you train, you're really driving a tank. When you train, you're really doing some hand-to-hand stuff. When you train, you're really driving like tanks. Now, I thought this happened in wartime, but there is a famous story of an accident that happened over the Imjin River in Korea. Now Major General Robert Dees, retired Army, he tells this story for the documentary Honoring the Code. I remember dialoguing about this recently because I told Bob, the founder and executive director of Crosswinds, that I wanted to include this in this season. And so we went and found the clip from Honoring the Code. And we were dialoguing and we said, this is such a pervasive story that we were talking about this at a Crosswinds event. I think it was a Songs of Hope or something here in town a couple years ago. And just casually, a gentleman who was a little bit older started dialoguing about this story with us because he had seen it in the film and he was actually there when this occurred and had remembered it. Notice this. Now this, I always thought when I heard the story the first time it happened in battle, this actually occurred not during combat. Pay attention to what Major General Robert Dees, retired Army, says.
One of our armored vehicles coming back from the DMZ had taken an erratic turn and had actually driven off the Imjin River Bridge, plunged 90 feet. And now the soldiers inside of that vehicle are under the water another 25 feet. We have Korean divers trying to get them, and yet we know that they're drowning. And there's a moral dimension to that. There's this moral dimension as a leader of woulda, coulda, shoulda. What could have I have done? How could have I have prevented this? They wouldn't if. And so I just looked him right in the running lights. And I said, Tom, you're the commander here. I believe in you. You're the one that can do the best possible on behalf of your troops. You need to honor the dead if that's the case, and you need to lead the living. Sometimes you talk to your soldiers about morality, but usually the sermon your soldiers understand is your life message and your example under the toughest of conditions. there's an expression that I use that says, crisis defines the character, and I would say the morality of the commander.
And let me show you another non-combat event. This is back to Sergeant Major James Bryant. He talks about jumping out of an airplane. So you can't just kind of walk through that. You either jump or you don't. And if the chute doesn't deploy, you've got a problem. And if they jump so close together, it wouldn't be abnormal for a guy coming down behind someone to land on another guy's chute. So the guy below you shoots open, it opens before you, you're going faster, yours doesn't open as quick, you hit his chute. If you do that, you're trained to kind of run off the chute to get some speed and to get away from him to where you can get some wind under yours, so that will open. Notice what he says happened to him.
Even on airborne operations, I was jumping on Sicily drop zone, and I jumped out of the aircraft where I just happened, I was a jump master, and I end up on another guy's parachute. Not good. That means there's no air in my parachute. And they teach you right off the bat, you run. You gotta run off the parachute so you can get air in your parachute. Long story short, I ran, but by the time I did get enough air in my parachute, I jammed both my ankles by hitting the drop zone. But the air did not deploy soon enough to allow me to have a soft landing, if you will. And so, yes, those type of accidents get overlooked because when you're actually training, they don't put the two and two together because it's not under combat situations. But the accidents are just as painful.
He was responsible for training men as well. So he saw a lot happen on base. That's why we've got so many stories featured. But it seems like he had a lot happen to him personally. Notice this story.
Actually, personally, we were at Fort Bragg, and I can't recall the year, we had a aircraft that had caught on fire, and they lost some soldiers.
Okay, now I want to shift gears here. This is one of Chris Turner's stories. Now this clip actually comes from the previous season, from one of the episodes where we featured Chris, and he was just telling his story. And I want to take you to some of the footage here where Chris received a promotion and the Marines are just around in the barracks and they're celebrating. Let me just let him tell you the story in his own words.
While I was in the Corps, and I was stationed at Camp Lejeune with 2nd Fleet Service Support Group, and I had just gotten meritoriously promoted to corporal, and I was assigned my fire team. So what I did was I had my fire team over to the barracks with me to celebrate my promotion, to get to know everybody, because I'm now their non-commissioned officer that's in charge of them. So there was 4 of us that showed up, myself included. So that would have made 5 of us. And one of the guys that was assigned to me, he was from Orangeburg, South Carolina. He was not the most squared away Marine. He was a dark green Marine. And, the platoon sergeant assigned him to me because he was one that needed the most, the most work, if you will. So I invited everybody over, and we're sitting down, and we, there was 5 of us, and I ordered, I got a 6-pack of something to drink, if you will, to keep it PG. And we ordered some pizzas, and we hung out till about 2:00 in the morning. I mean, there was nothing really explicit about it, except for the fact that we were just hanging out and just camaraderie and just being Marines. So about 1:30 in the morning.
There's nothing explicit about it except for we were hanging out. So,
yeah, exactly.
So like what you're saying is, so when Marines are hanging out, it is explicit, is what you're.
It can get very visual, if you will.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So, yeah,
But,
all right. Okay, so let's set up the scene here. They're celebrating, they're enjoying this, they're having fun. There's no indication that anything is wrong. They're parting ways. It's very late at night, actually probably very early in the morning. They're going to rally together in less than 4 hours, and notice what occurs.
But we left. Everybody shook my hand and gave me a bro hug and said, "Congratulations, Corporal Turner. Looking forward to it," and all this stuff. And the last one that did that, his name was Private Sprinkle. He's like, "Hey, Corporal Turner, I'll see you in the morning." I was like, "Good to go. We got formation at 0530 to step off for PT, which is physical training. We take off when we run, exercises, calisthenics, and all that stuff. So I go to bed. It's probably about 2 in the morning. My phone rings at 4:45, and the barracks duty NCO calls me and says, "Corporal Turner, we need you down here at the enlisted barracks because we've got an issue with Private Sprinkle." It's like, okay, what's going on? It's like, just come down here and we'll go through it when you get down here.
How old were you? How old were you when this was going
on? 21.
Okay, so I'm just trying to
20.
Put in perspective.
Yeah, I was 21, 22 years old. Yeah,
because the guys that are leading this for our country are, I mean, they're really young. I mean, massive experience with what they've done, but man, they're taking on a lot of responsibility. Okay, so 21, you're going to sleep thinking
21, 22 years. Yeah, 21, 22 years old, man. You got you've got sergeants that have been in the Corps and they're coming up on the end of their enlistment, and they're leading platoons of Marines to take kills and fight out of fighting holes and friggin' infiltrate buildings and such. So
right.
But anyway, I get down to the barracks and there's ambulances and military police surrounding the front of the barracks, and I'm like, man, he done come back down here and just drank all night long. And what Marines do whenever they're in the rear and they're away from their families. I walk in and the MPs are there, and the duty NCO pulls me to the side. He's like, "Corporal Turner, we found PFC Sprinkle about an hour ago, and he had hung himself." And he had left my room, went back to his barracks and stuck a web belt around his neck and hung himself from the top bunk. And I never saw it coming. No signs, no nothing.
So, I'm thinking about this when I'm talking to Chris about this story. And we just dialogue through it. And I've talked with him several times about it. I know Chris fairly well. So what do you make of that? He's years removed now. This is 20 years ago. It's still is fresh on his mind. He's able to talk about it more freely. There was no indication that anything was occurring. And again, this is a man who says, "Well, I'm not a combat veteran," yet here is trauma that's happened. You start getting things like survivor's guilt. Well, should I have seen it? Or why didn't I see it? Or was I too caught up in the moment? And you go, well, there's no indication. Nothing would have. In fact, Chris continues right here. We're going to feature him talking on a future episode about moral injury as well. But I want you to notice this here.
We got it. Myself and my fire team, we got investigated by NCIS to see if there was any telltale signs or what his mood was or why he would have done this. And for me, I had survivor's guilt for about 5 years after that, trying to figure out why I never saw it coming. I never saw it. And the thing is he did it under my watch. He was my Marine.
Yeah.
And it got me for the longest time. So that's where a lot of my stuff that happened in my childhood, but this too, that's where, after about 4 or 5 years, where I started actually grasping the fact that I had internal demons that I needed to deal with, that eventually became known as PTSD and moral injury, which they didn't really put a label on it until like 2005, 2006 or something like that. And this all happened in 2001, 2002.
Now, I did ask Chris, I said, what now do you make of it if you look back, if you take, just a gaze back in the rearview mirror, what do you put together about this? Here's what he says.
Right. Well, there's one thing that we're taught in the Marine Corps. Suck it up. And if you needed a wife, the government would have issued you one. And if you feel like you're in pain is weakness, pride is forever.
Right.
So we keep everything as Marines compartmentalized, and it's just the way we're trained in boot camp. And there's nothing wrong with it, man, because we are riflemen, and we are the grunts, and we are the ground force of the United States.
Pull all these pieces together. What we've seen is on a military base, in a non-war environment, and even as you get outside the base in a non-war situation, non-combat situation, is you can have these accidents that can result in fatalities. You can also have other types of fatalities and near-death experiences that occur, parachutes that go bad. You can have a suicide, somebody taking their life, planes that go down or catch on fire. I want to show you this too. This is back to Sergeant Major Bryant, where sometimes even violence, not just perpetrated against oneself, but against others, takes place on these bases, non-combat situations as well.
There was an incident where we had a sniper actually on a place called Tower Stadium. He was shooting at people, and I was actually running my unit past that location when the shooting had just started right after we passed by. And just the mere fact of knowing that had we waited about 5 minutes earlier, we've been right in the middle of it. And that, it never hits you until after the fact. When you hear about it, wait a minute, we just ran past that. Had we been there 5 minutes earlier, that could have happened to us. And so that aspect of it, just knowing that could have been us.
Now, you might want to listen back to that clip. In that clip, I think he's saying, if we had left earlier, and I think he means if we had left just a little bit later, like we were earlier than that event. But still, the idea is the same there. Many times I've thought about, because I'll be driving and there'll be an accident. I was going to leave, earlier and I didn't, and then there's an accident, and then I come up on it, and I think, did I miss that because I left later than I should have, than I planned to? Sometimes you got these near misses. Right here, it takes on an entirely different level, and he does bring up this idea that I want you to pay attention to, that when you train, you generally train at combat speed. You don't just train by just, as we referenced earlier, just kind of walking through something or thinking through it. Like you kind of walk through a wedding to prepare for it, but you don't really get married. Okay, and then the next day, that was just the dress rehearsal. You can't really dress rehearse combat. And so many times the accidents occur because you're training at full speed. And when it occurs, he has this interesting thing that he says, even if, and we don't want to take anything away from combat. So we don't want to say, hey, that was a combat thing that occurred, but we can say, hey, that occurred was still traumatic. Notice how he terms it here.
That's traumatic. So I think that's something I think we need to change the trend on, even now, and recognizing the fact that, hey, look, we don't have to treat it like it's a combat accident, but it's trauma. And that accident can affect that person the rest of their life. Knowing that when I was on the parachute, if I didn't get any air at all, I could definitely have lost my life. I have seen guys who actually jumped on an operation that we were on, and they actually lost their life. They never got in the air in that parachute, and boom, they actually died. And you hear about that, and a lot of times because it may not be someone in your unit or someone that you know, but the mere fact that, wow, I was jumping on that operation, I was on one of the aircrafts, and that accident could have been me. So I do think we minimize that, and a lot of people do have to deal with it, but they take that and they sort of water it down so, well, I don't worry about that because I wasn't actually in combat.
Again, not to take anything away from combat at all, but just to say, in the same way that war changes people, non-war can change people as well. Let me go back to our definition in closing of post-traumatic stress disorder. I'm going to read it straight from the Disentangled book. That's what you see if you're watching on video. If you're listening, I'm referring to the Disentangled. This is the Bible study that we have. This definition is also in the Warrior Hope Manual. That's a 10-lesson study on basic training for living on mission. That one is not a Bible study. The definition is in both. This is the American Psychiatric Association definition, so not ours. This is the official definition. Post-traumatic stress. It's a psychiatric disorder that can occur, in people who have experienced or witnessed a traumatic event such as a natural disaster, storms, hurricanes, earthquakes can do it, a serious accident that could do it, a terrorist act, war or combat is on the list. Now, it doesn't mean that it's going to happen if you go through war or combat. It means it could happen. But I'd say there's a high probability that you'll have some stuff to deal with. Rape or other violent personal assault. So notice, someone can have PTSD, as we say here in the book, even if they've not experienced an event firsthand. It's possible for those who have witnessed an event, just reading from the book, to be traumatized just as those who experienced the event. Being in a car accident can result in PTSD, but witnessing such an event can also have the same effect. We all respond to experiences differently. And then second, there's not a comprehensive list of stressors that cause PTSD. So although we do, with this Warriors on Mission, Warrior Hope Project, deal with not all PTSD, but with combat and veteran-specific PTSD, it's not an exhaustive list. But here's a guideline. It can be the result of such things as hurricanes, natural disaster, automobile collisions, that's a serious accident, car bombings, that's a terrorist act, mortar attacks, that'd be war or combat, rape, that's violent personal assault, or as we heard in this episode, or saw if you're watching, it could be from a parachute accident, near-death experience. It could be from a sniper being on base and people died, and it could have been you if you were there just a little bit later. It could happen because you were not able to save men who drowned in a tank, or you're the one who even ordered them into the tank, or you just saw it. Or it could be someone that you thought was under your watch, under your care, or even a friend of yours that you saw 4 hours earlier took their life, or you could just feel you're separated from your family from a lengthy period of time, and you come back and things are radically different than they were before, or they're exactly the same, but where did the time go? You see, the issue is when something like that happens, we don't have to necessarily label what caused it. We don't necessarily have to figure all the details out, but we do need to process it in such a way that we can move forward so that we don't continue living out the present in light of the past pains. And again, let me remind you that so often these emotional hurts and wounds, they don't show us what's wrong with us. They really highlight what's right. Many of these things are traumatic, they're big, and it would be less normal to not be affected by these things than it would be to be affected and changed by them. Life is beautiful, but life is so sometimes difficult. Okay, I'm signing off. I'm Andy Jenkins. This is the Warrior Hope Podcast, brought to you by Crosswinds Foundation for Faith and Culture. In the next episode, I'll tell you what, we're going to be talking about this idea when something comes up, whether it's war, non-war, you can push that thing down, or you can push through it. Ideally, you will choose not to push it down and push it away, but you'll choose to push through. I'll see you in the next episode.